Welcome back, everyone. We missed bringing you our webinar last week, and we're happy to have you join us today. Our speakers are joining you COVID casual from their homes and offices in different places around the U.S. We hope you're enjoying yourself this afternoon. We do have a very interesting topic to bring to you today, providing an update on the state of the rotorcraft industry and an insight into hiring practices in the rotorcraft industry during a pandemic. Our speakers today are going to be Jim Viola, who is our president and CEO of HAI. We also have Mike Maurer, who is the executive director of aviation and chief flight instructor for Southern Utah University. Joining him is Robbie Paul, who is the assistant chief instructor for aviation at SUU. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Bierke, Associate Dean and Professor for Aerospace and Professor of Aviation at the University of North Dakota. And we have Wes Vandell, who is Chief Flight Instructor for Helicopters at the University of North Dakota. Today, you have the opportunity to ask questions during the webinar. We encourage you to do so. For those of you who are not familiar with GoToWebinar, there is a module on the side of your screen that's labeled questions. All you have to do is type your question into that module and it will send it to us. We will handle all the questions at the end of the webinar. We will not be taking them during the course of the presentations. The other part of it is you all will receive a copy of the video link from today's presentation. So if there's something you missed or you want to go back and listen to it again, you are welcome to do so. Now I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, our president and CEO at HAI.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and appreciate you joining us this afternoon for our...
Jim, can you turn your camera on?
I thought I did.
Oh, I guess I missed it. Apologize.
Okay, am I good? All
yes.
Right. Okay, so good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. On the stats that we got, it looks like we got over 20 countries again. So we're certainly trying to work the international part as well. And I know while a lot of our speakers are from our US based, we certainly want to open it up to international issues. So if you know, when it comes question and answer time, please let us know what we can do next week or a couple weeks out, and so we can answer some of your questions. I did talk prior to that, you know, prior to COVID-19 hitting up around the world, you know, there was a shortage of pilots, mechanics, and big time shortages. We're talking in the numbers of 19,000, 20,000, and so that was back in 2017. And we thought we wanted to do is we had the University of North Dakota do a study to, you know, rather than just have a hunch that we're going to be running behind on pilots, we want to actually put some facts in there. And they did a great job that confirmed that over the next 15 years, we'd be short some 40,000 mechanics as well as pilots, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 to 8,000. So with that, we start trying to figure out how we can make sure there was things in place to feed that pipeline. Of course, now, you know, we got COVID-19, which is affecting what's happening right now, but in the vertical lift area, we know that because of our diverse membership, as well as the diverse missions that we do around the world, with the firefighting and police and medical, I mean, there are still going to be work out there. And when the economy picks up here in the United States as well as around the world, that shortage of pilots and the bigger shortage of mechanics is going to be something that we have to deal with. So I really appreciate that two universities stepping up today, giving us the time and bringing us the knowledge so we can ensure that we're prepared to continue to do the work of the vertical flight industry needs to do. And the most important asset is, of course, the human being involved, which is the pilot and the mechanic. So with that, let's get on to, I appreciate Beth and Mike. Thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to you to provide that insight to our group here. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. As Jim said, it's really nice to have two universities here who represent a fairly large segment of the training industry, and allowing us to give the insight into what we're seeing and what we believe some of the major issues are going to be as the pandemic rages on, and then post-pandemic, and how we're going to recover as an industry. And one of the big things that we feel that really needs to be focused on and considered is that pipeline. The pipeline has taken years to establish. Various industries, various partners across the collegiate rotor training world, as well as many private training institutions have worked very hard to establish these pipelines, and overnight they were destroyed. As we have seen, many small, what we would call the mom and pop operations just could not survive. And this has created many issues that we're currently dealing with, and we believe we're going to be dealing with for years to come. So there's some things that we need to act on right now, and we're really seeking industry guidance on how we can solve some of these issues. But one of the big questions we've been asked is, what does the job market look like, and what can be expected? We have seen in just our Western region, as the tour industry has shut down, as the oil operations have ceased to make as many flights as they have, that the flood to the EMS world has just increased, and it has increased dramatically. Many of our partners and many of our friends in the EMS community are seeing unprecedented numbers of the high-hour pilots that are suddenly, the oil industry was shut down, or some of these senior folks from the tour industry, they didn't have anywhere to go, so they went back to the EMS world. Now, while that is not necessarily an issue, it does solve some of the short-term concerns from an employment standpoint, as well as making sure that these critical services are still being provided. But what it is shutting down is that pipeline, and I'm going to keep touching on that pipeline. Older, more experienced pilots are continuing to get hours and get experience. The younger pilots, who in the next few years are going to be expected to move into these positions, are now no longer getting any time. They're not getting experience, and that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with for years to come, unless we can figure out a way to continue to bridge that gap and make sure that we are getting experience to the next generation of pilots. How are we getting folks from that 200 to the 1,000 hours, the 1,000 to the 15 to the 2,000 hour? And that's been one of the largest concerns, as the experienced pilots who can take these jobs are flooding back. Anything to that, Robbie?
So, no, I mean, yeah, really the only thing I'd add to that is just a lot with us, specifically with our students. We're still seeing a lot of our graduates that just graduated in spring that are finding jobs with some smaller operators, but not nearly at the rates as they were previously. And so, like Mike said, that really is our concern. From our standpoint, we still have lots of students, lots of applicants for our program. Our program, is at capacity. But we're concerned about those first tier jobs, being able to find these students that are, have fallen in love. They want to be the future of this industry, and being able to get them up to the amount of hours that they need to actually be a part of the companies that they really want to be.
Yeah, the shut off of the pipeline, the way that the U.S. trains is the aperture at the front of somebody's career is very large. They're gathering hours, they're doing all these jobs. And on the back end, you have the few high-hour folks with the the multiple thousands of hours, 5,000 to 10,000 hours that are doing the more technical work. Our biggest concern, though, is if that aperture at the front is getting closed off, because the typical path for tours, if that's not going to be something that's going to bounce back quickly, we have to shift those experience, or shift the experience in those training. What we would call the training companies, they have to be, those pilots have to be shifted there. So ag work, maybe some of the smaller tour operators across the country. But Vegas has been a very big player in promoting and making sure that the EMS world, the utility operators, that they're getting highly trained and competent pilots with the required hours. And I think as an industry, we need to be very concerned if the tour industry does not come back quickly, what that's going to mean long term for the rest of the industry. The next thing that we wanted to talk about is the shortage, and what do we think the shortage is actually going to be after this pandemic. And I know UND's got some numbers, and they're gonna touch more on this. But from our perspective and what we're seeing, from an overall pilot standpoint, the older and more experienced pilots, their clock is still ticking. Their medicals they still have to be renewed. At some point, the longer this goes on, more and more of those senior pilots are not going to be able to continue. The issue that we're very concerned with is if this continues for an extended period, those older pilots are going to start to retire in larger and larger numbers, or they're not going to be able to fly because they've got a medical issue. Now we are going to compound the issue of inexperienced pilots with a shortage of hours with higher time pilots who have simply timed out. Their clock is expired. And the making sure that we're feeding that pipeline is going to be even more critical. Let's see here. All right. You want to go to the next one?
Jump into this.
Okay.
So another thing that we've been asked a lot, of course, is just how are we as a school handling the pandemic? Luckily for us, because of the location that we're at in southern Utah, with the state never being shut down, we never, as a school, closed. We never shut down. We continued flight operations. We graduated a new class for the spring, and last week we started our summer semester, and we are rolling just as fast as ever with over 160 current students. And so luckily, we've been able to implement things that have allowed us to do that. We're sanitizing our aircraft between every single flight. We have a single point of entry into our hangar space where people are being screened, temperatures and things to make sure that they're feeling healthy and that we're not putting people at risk. And we've also moved a lot of our, actually all of our courses have become all online, other than the one-on-one time with our instructors. So luckily, because of the safety measures that we've been able to put in place, we are still rolling. And in fact, the forecast that we're looking at hasn't changed. In fact, we have over 360 applicants for our fall semester. Obviously, we can't take all of those. We only have about 40 slots that we're going to be able to take, so we'll have to pick and choose which students come in. And we're still getting 7 applicants per week for the fall semester, and we're already at 95 applicants for spring. So even with the pandemic, we've actually seen an increase in the number of applicants for our program. So there's still this huge interest for people to become helicopter pilots. That hasn't slowed down. So for us, through this, we're just plowing right along. And again, like Mike has already addressed several times, our concern is not about finding people that still want to fly helicopters. Our concern is there going to be interest if we don't take care of those tier 1 and tier 2 jobs, making sure that those companies stay open and are still hiring.
Yeah, and Robbie brought up the point that we're seeing a record number of applicants coming in. Now, normally that'd be great news. The problem with these applicants coming in is that is a symptom of the industry. We know just in the state of Utah that several of the smaller schools have just closed, and their students, being in various stages of their training, have sought some other place to continue their training. And so, as we've seen an increase in students transferring from schools that are going out of business, that's something that's very scary to us. As we're looking at an industry that at some point will have the same level of demand. If after this pandemic is completely over, if, as we believe, there are going to be fewer schools, and those schools will probably be larger and more robust, the problem is if we're down to fewer schools, our capacity as a nation to produce pilots to meet the demand, whatever that demand may be, is going to be significantly diminished. So for everybody that's attending this webinar, if there are things or best practices that we can share, we're happy to do so. We want to help any way we can, and if we can find maybe maybe students who are coming here only because it's one of the few places left open, but maybe your program or your operation is pending reopening here in the next few months or maybe even next year. We'd love to know, because we can't train everybody. We're actually beyond capacity right now, and if there's things that we can share, like I said, best practices, even some of the political nuances that we've been able to wrangle here in the state of Utah that may help you in your location, we're happy to share.
Okay. Well, I think the last thing that we've been asked a lot and asked to talk about today as well is a little bit about our Amt program. Of course, maintenance also a huge issue right now with all of this. In addition to the pilots. For us, our program is very, very new, so we don't have a ton of information that we're able to share. We just opened up in January, so we're not like seeing graduates that we could tell you if they're still being able to, find jobs and those kind of things currently right now. But what we can tell you is that we have seen an increased interest in AMTs. And a lot of those happen to be those in their 30s and 40s that have been laid off during the pandemic, that are unemployed, and they're looking for more stable employment. And they see maintenance as one of those, as we've still had to, and we talked a little bit earlier just before the seminar started here, that even during shutdowns, the maintainers are still working on the aircraft and making sure that they were ready to go for when it came back. And so we've seen a huge interest there as well. It is a little bit tough because things like auto shop classes in high schools, we can't get in, we can't talk to those students, we can't recruit there right currently. So we're not seeing huge numbers of high school students at the moment because of the lack of that's there. But we are seeing a little bit of the older people that are able to, that they want to switch careers and get into this. So it's really, really nice.
That's actually a really good point. We have seen as a university, and I'm sure this is the same with University of North Dakota, that as the economy starts to deteriorate, a lot of folks will seek education and they'll go back to school to hopefully better their situation. And as Robbie pointed out, we're seeing that on the maintenance side, even though our program is relatively small. But when it comes to the our rotor and fixed wing programs, we're definitely seeing some of these folks that were laid off from whatever company they were previously working at and are now seeking aviation as that stable platform to come back to. So from a demand standpoint, the training world for the schools that are open and we're able to survive this appears to be alive and well. What we do with the students upon graduation is an industry issue that must be solved. And we're very much open to ideas and looking for ways to make sure that we're meeting the industry demands across the country. So I think with that, that's our presentation. We do appreciate everybody listening and attending.
Thank you, Mike and Robbie. Certainly appreciate that. We will now move into Dr. Bjerke and Wes for their section. I invite you to turn your cameras and your microphones on.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mike and Robbie, for that information. I think we're going to kind of build upon some of those topics that were already discussed. See if I can move the slide up again. Oh, sorry, this is a little user error, so please bear with me. One thing I was going to mention, back in 2018, we were fortunate enough to do a study in coordination with the Helicopter Association looking at helicopter pilot and maintenance supply. Back in 2018, a lot can change in just 2 short years. During this study, like Jim mentioned earlier, we did, thank you for fixing my slides, we did predict a shortage of both helicopter pilots and maintenance technicians, close to 8,000 helicopter pilots between 2018 and 2036. Again, a major issue for this industry. We also saw one of the biggest threats to that pilot supply was really poaching from other industries. One of the biggest areas taking well-seasoned helicopter pilots was the fixed-wing airline industry. We had seen the start really in 2018 of the regional airlines paying for that transition training from fixed-wing to helicopter pilots to fixed-wing flying. And over the period of the last couple of years, quite a few pilots have made that transition. I should mention that we've been doing pilot supply forecasting for quite some time at our university with very accurate results, but also every time we do this forecast, we do kick it up by talking about this really is a status quo forecast, meaning that it's all good if there are no overall changes in the industry, and we also warn that any unforeseen change like a war or an epidemic or a global recession could likely drastically alter these forecasting numbers. That's why forecasts are only good as well as it's using data staying consistent. You know, unfortunately right now, I think we're seeing both a pandemic and a possible global recession here hitting us very hard, and it's too soon to know what that long-time impact of that will be, especially on the aviation industry as kind of front and center, especially with the tourism and the travel aspect of it. As well as the financial crisis to what we're seeing. So again, between 2018 and 2020, things were looking really great for the training providers as well as the industry outlook. Like Southern Utah, we too were seeing a rise in our student numbers, almost more than we could handle at that time. I know after we presented our helicopter pilot supply study and talked about the need for these pathway programs to take a helicopter pilot, freshly minted commercial pilot, build those hours of experience, go to those tier 1 jobs along to those tier 2, we actually were able to create a couple of federal as well as commercial pathway programs for our students. We were also gearing up in April of this year for one of our annual career fairs, and we were going to have the most helicopter companies present than we've ever had. So again, very exciting times that of course all came to a pretty screeching halt mid-March across the country. So some of the initial impacts that COVID-19 is going to have on the workforce. Again, the largest immediate one is that delay, that stoppage of flight training. Unlike Southern Utah, we did have to shut down our flight operations for nearly 2.5 months. We were fortunate enough to get that started back up just this week. In fact, Wes is going to be talking quite a bit more detail about that. But that is a 2.5 month stop where no new pilots were created, no new training. Now we're slowly bringing our instructors back, getting them back proficient, then we'll bring our students back. But we lost that 2.5 months. There's no getting that time back, that experience, those hours, that pilot creation back. And that kind of delay is just going to have a ripple down effect as we try to educate and train new pilots. Also with student recruitment numbers, this is something that I find very fascinating. We all know that this industry is extremely cyclical. You know, in these events, whether it's wars, terrorism, pandemics, recessions, they have a lasting impact. One of the things that we've compared over the years is actually new student recruitment, new student interest oftentimes lags the cyclical nature of the industry about 2 years. So when you compare it to 9/11, you compare it to the recession in 08, you compare it to some of the smaller pandemics like SARS or H1N1, we wouldn't see the impact of our student numbers immediately following the event. It would happen usually about 2 years after the fact. And then as the industry increases again, we would lag again about 2 years before we started seeing our numbers climb back up. So when I look at this coming summer and fall semester, you know, our student numbers are still very strong. They're right around where we anticipated them to be. Now, again, things can change. Universities, if we are forced, right now we're planning to be face-to-face instruction and one-on-one flight training in the fall semester. If we move to completely online for the fall, I think across the board, all of our numbers are gonna fall. We're finding that this generation does not necessarily enjoy 100% online education, especially the traditional age students. So that could be an impact. But I'm pretty confident for our fall numbers. What I'm most worried about now is 2 years from now, so the fall of 2021, and seeing those numbers drop off, primarily because the industry is hurting, those opportunities aren't there, as well as we're not able to recruit students and bring them on campus for visits and things like that that excite them about joining the aviation industry. We also have to be extremely cognizant about the financial ramifications that are going to come out of this pandemic. So Again, kind of similar to what we saw in 2008-9 during the recession there. It was very limited on loans that students could apply for, especially when their parents are co-signers. If they too were out of work, again, that income is just not there to pay for the cost of flight training. And of course, having that diminishing of jobs, I think that Southern Utah covered well, is definitely a negative impact happening on the workforce. Again, one of the possibly positive impacts, when we did brief our study back in 2018, again, we kind of recognized, and this was very early on in this transition sort of poaching scheme from the airlines, when there was a huge shortage, especially at the regional airline level. They were getting incredibly creative on recruiting pilots, and they kind of picked up right away that they could transition rotor pilots, and they would make for excellent airline pilots, and they were doing that pretty much every single one of the regional airlines were offering quite lucrative financial incentives to transition someone over, and they were having great success with these pilots, hence spending more and more resources to attract them. I did reach out to a few of our regional airline partners just to ask what was the status of these programs at this time. For the most part, the websites no longer exist on at these airlines, as well as they've been halted, the ones that I talked to, for the foreseeable future, simply because the airlines are also extremely hit by this pandemic and looking at possible reduction in workforce as well. So again, that might be a positive for the helicopter industry, that at least momentarily in the short term, and perhaps the long term, sort of the losing of those qualified pilots is no longer happening, especially at the rates that it was just a few short months ago. So also the financial support for flight training is always a thing to be considered, whether it's fixed wing or helicopter flight training. It is expensive. You know, at our university, helicopter training costs about twice as much as our fixed wing. And so again, when times are tough, we all know the unemployment rate as of late. Again, it's difficult for students to necessarily find the financial backing to support this passion of becoming a helicopter pilot. Again, at our university, students can apply for federal financial aid if they're U.S. citizens, as well as we have a number of specific scholarships available for them. But again, it is an investment, and it might not be something that is possible during this time. So, you know, recommendations to assist with this. Again, having stability, financial aid available, helping students navigate that puzzle, helping them find scholarships that are out there, both internal to the organizations as well as external support and scholarships. And then, of course, many of our students in our helicopter program at the University of North Dakota do come in with a well-deserved benefit as being a veteran, which does help cover those expenses for them. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Wes Vandell, who is our Chief Helicopter Instructor at the University of North Dakota.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bierke. What I'd like to talk about in the remaining time here is just a little bit about where we were, and then what we're doing now, and then kind of how we see the future of flight training shaping up at the University of North Dakota. So flight training at UND Aerospace, you know, annually, last year anyway, we did about 134,000 flight hours. We have 14 different degree programs, all of which, if they require flight training, you're able to use helicopters in. There's 1,400 active flight students. I think that's actually more now in these coming semesters, just as we see enrollment going up, but only about 8% of that is helicopter. Well, that's interesting is that at UND, that kind of makes us a microcosm of the whole aviation industry. You know, majority fixed wing, about 8% of that is being helicopters. So the trends we see in the industry and things we see at in the whole aviation industry are mirrored here at UND. And we did just celebrate our 50th anniversary in 2018. So we have seen crises before. Even just in my time here, you know, September 11th obviously caused a major panic in the aviation industry, and then the financial recession in 2008. So we've seen it before, but we've never seen anything like this. It's important to understand that this is new ground. We've never been shut down for this long. We did shut down after 9/11, but we were up and training fairly quickly. And this has been something that's been unprecedented in the entire aviation industry. So what we've done lately anyway, just to increase our recruitment and make helicopter training more attractive in general, this really started for us back in 2013. Before that, we were mostly contract training here. There wasn't as strong interest for what we call undergraduate program training. So, you know, student coming in on his own, paying for flight training, it just wasn't approachable in the models that we were presenting. So we have gone through steps since then, obviously, to make it more affordable and attractive to students. A lot of that just deals with minimizing costs by eliminating certain programs, streamlining our training as much as possible, really providing the experience that's required for those first tier jobs. And then the final step to that, which really only has taken place really for the last few years, so since 2017, has been developing career pathway programs. Even, you know, since I've been at the university here since early 2000s, we've never had a career pathway program on the helicopter side. And going into this pandemic, we had several that were lined up where students could go after they'd gained their hours as a flight instructor. And it was really the first time in decades that we had been able to achieve that. So where were we pre-pandemic? We had those pathways. We were really in the best state that we had ever seen as far as helicopter training goes at the University of North Dakota. We had our highest level of non-contract training student enrollment. We had a near 100% placement rate, both for CFIs that were coming in or through our program that we would hire, and then post our building when they get to that tier 1 job. There was just a lot of demand. You know, there was a lot of opportunity and places for them to go. Again, being this kind of small picture of the whole aviation industry, our largest competition, oddly enough, was fixed wing programs. Pre-pandemic, you know, the fixed wing programs were offering tremendous incentives, even to freshmen coming into the university. Were being recruited by airlines and offered scholarships and financial rewards for doing that. That just never it hasn't existed on the helicopter side, and we as an industry have always kind of lagged behind the fixed wing pilot recruitment side. We were starting to catch up, and then obviously this crisis hit, and this is kind of what we're looking at now post-pandemic. Obviously, it's still early days post-pandemic. Well, we're still in the middle of it. So it's very hard to say kind of how we will be affected down the road. We do know short-term, you know, the majority of our students who are here are being retained. We still have new enrollments, just like SEU mentioned. You know, this summer and fall is looking very good. And as Beth mentioned, you know, it's really going to look 2 years into the future for us to see, you know, how this is really going to affect us. And that's really only once we get through this. And just make that clear, I mean, we are not through this yet. We're dealing with it, we're surviving it, but we don't know what it's going to look like once the world finally gets a grip on it. And our largest challenge, you know, to reiterate what SEU said, is really the survival of those tier 1 operators. And then, as Dr. Rierke mentioned, you know, the availability of financial aid is going to be a major issue or major concern for new student recruitment coming in, and just how the global economy looks at that time. So what does training look like in a COVID-19 world? So this is something that Robbie talked about. You know, they've been flying really throughout the pandemic. We just started flight training again this Tuesday. And during that time, we had worked with, you know, our local Department of Health and the CDC to develop guidelines and things like that to try and make it as safe as possible. So what does it look like from a day-to-day type operations? First of all, we know there's going to be fewer students per instructor for the increased time required to clean the aircraft, the increased screening procedures and things like that. And just the fact that we don't want a student jumping from one instructor to another. We want more continuity to try and reduce the amount of transmissible moments between individuals. So we know that's going to be a major factor. We are doing health screening at the airport. You know, whenever somebody comes out to the airport, whether they're flight training or not, they do go through a health screening. We are requiring masks in all public spaces, so anytime that you're doing a briefing, and we do require it in the aircraft as well, anytime you're within that 6-foot CDC recommended guideline, we do require you wear a mask. And then we are disinfecting the aircraft. You can kind of see our sheet here on how to clean the aircraft between each flight. We're also requiring, for now anyway, gloves in the aircraft. That's mainly because we operate with touchscreen avionics, and touchscreens, they're very hard to clean in comparison to most surfaces. So it just became essential as we got started to require gloves. And the question always comes up, so what do you do if there is an outbreak, or if you have a student who does test positive for COVID-19? And that's really where we're fortunate, we have a university behind us. We have the North Dakota Department of Health supporting us. And that's where the contact tracing really begins at those levels, to try and figure out, well, who was affected. And as much as we can minimize those transmissible moments, it really helps with that contact tracing going forward. So this is kind of what it looks like. Yeah, it does look a little different having masks and gloves in the cockpit. But it is, I've done several flights now. It's just something you have to get used to. It's not a drastic change by any means. Yes, you can still talk on the radios. That seems to be the most common question, is, are we getting a lot of say-agains and stuff like that? And the answer is no. We know obviously that works quite well. So where do we see the future of flight training going? Recruitment has become a major concern. Short term, the tier 1 job is really going to affect our pipelines going forward. But even longer term than that, so looking 2 years in the future, if we're not bringing them in at the training level is really the base of the pyramid. And then you have the tier 1 job after that. Taking out the tier 1 job really affects the ones above that. But if training goes away, if we do end up seeing in 2 years' time a decrease in training due to the financial situation, due to just lack of interest in a volatile industry, if that base of the pyramid goes away, that's a challenge that we're also going to have to face as an industry. And there's a few ways to do that. It is going to be a new challenge, but really what we had going into this pandemic was we were providing that light at the end of the tunnel. Yes, you want to be a helicopter pilot. How realistic is that as a career? And those pathway programs really create that light at the end of the tunnel. So that's going to be vital, not just to the students that are already here, but also to the students who are looking at coming into flight training and trying to figure out, okay, is this viable for me? Is this worth the investment for me? So being able to provide that affects the training pipeline as well as the tier 1 pipeline. And then I think Robbie mentioned that outreach to students, whether prospective students or even current students. We know we're not going to be bringing students in for tours. I believe we do, 4 open houses at least, typically in the summertime, where we bring in, hundreds of prospective students so they can see the facilities and things like that. We're just not going to be able to do that in the short term. So we're looking at ways to provide virtual tours, virtual experiences, where people can do that safely from their own home, if possible. And then providing remote instruction. That is something that we've been working on with the FAA really since the start, is how can we provide that briefing even without being face-to-face with each other. Obviously, the flight training side, there's no way around that. We do have, all of our ground schools are virtual now. It's not something that we're getting used to, but providing as much remote instruction as possible is going to be very important to retain students and also just keep the integrity of the program. And then of course, outreach to the younger generation via social media as much as possible, whether it's training videos on YouTube that are promoting kinds of things that we do in this industry, highlighting the safety aspects and the different job segments that are available. The more that we can get that out as an industry, the more interest there's going to be for students that want to become helicopter pilots in the future. So just to kind of summarize that, short term, things are going to look very different. even from a day-to-day operations side here. And we do also, that's an important thing to understand as well, since we are still in this, we do expect more shutdowns. Now, I don't just mean at a university level, but more shutdowns of international travel. You know, if there's a huge spike again in Asia or in Europe, and international travel drops off, that again is going to have a massive effect on those tier one, especially tour operators that rely so much on international travel to certain destinations. So we do expect kind of a ripple effect from this initial shutdown as more and more of these occur, hopefully in much smaller quantity, but it is something that we expect to reoccur. And then, yeah, developing remote training programs is going to be essential to continuing training, and then looking at ways to expand our outreach to the younger generation to bring in the next generation of helicopter student pilots, which would then ensure that give some confidence to our pathway partners that there is a pipeline coming to them, so that those tier one operators can continue to operate and then move up higher up the pyramid into those career level jobs. So with that, we appreciate your time. We'll be around for Q&A. I'm going to hand it back to Dan, I believe now.
Oh, I do appreciate that, Wes and Dr. Bjerke. I invite Mike and Robbie to turn your camera back on. We'll get everybody to bring the cameras up so we can ask some questions. One of the questions that occurred to me as you were making your presentations, and this is probably a little self-serving, but do the unique capabilities of helicopters provide an advantage in recovery periods over fixed wing flight requirements? We know that there are a lot of pilots in the airlines who came from the helicopter world. We know they may not come back quite as quickly, but does the helicopter industry seem like it could bounce back faster?
If I may, one of the things that we have seen, not only with the students and some of our instructors that have left to go on to jobs despite the pandemic, is because the nature of what the rotor industry, really what it does. The airlines are there's only one thing they do. They fly people from point A to point B for the most part, or cargo, but it's point A to point B. I think the very nature of rotor and where we've seen our graduates and instructors where they've gone in the last, really since this pandemic began, and even just recently, they've all gone to different aspects of our industry. And so from what we're seeing, it's simply because we are so varied and we're not single mission focused. I think we're seeing that it's coming back quicker.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, and yeah, I think we're seeing the same thing. You know, certain industries, of course, are highly affected, tours and the like. But you know, our government contractors are still working around the clock. EMS operators are booming, as Mike mentioned earlier. Those segments will continue to strive, and we've actually seen quite a reversal in flow of people who had left the helicopter industry to go to these transition programs are now coming back into the helicopter industry because they are seeing how affected the airline industry can be by these events versus the job that they may have left, like EMS.
Well, actually, that brings up another question. Will those pilots who left, perhaps with high times and lots of experience, will they gain priority over hiring for, say, a younger pilot who might have just achieved, you know, some of the minimum standards that companies look for?
Yeah, I think that's something that you know, every individual company will look at, and I think it depends too if there's a history with that company. So if you were an A-star pilot at a certain base and you just left and that job is still open, they will likely give you priority going back to that same position. But I think it depends on time away as well. If you're away for 10 years, that's going to have a major effect. You're going to need recurrent training, and it's probably less likely that you'd be given that priority going versus somebody who's has recent experience and recent training and those kind of things.
Okay. Question, do any of the helicopter companies hire pilots or mechanics just for the fire seasons, or do government agencies have minimums that contracted companies must meet?
Depends on the company.
Yeah, we've placed folks on a seasonal basis with the utility companies, the firefighting folks, and we've also placed folks that weren't seasonal. So I think it really does vary based on the contract and based on the company.
Okay. What questions should a person interested in pursuing a career in helicopters ask potential flight schools? And it's two parts. Why is a university program better than a local flight school?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously, I'm sure UND gets the same question all the time from people. And really, there's pluses and minuses to both sides. If you go the non-university route, the positives are you're probably going to get through it quicker. The cost is probably going to be a little bit lower, but the quality of training may not be up to what you're going to see from a university program. The equipment isn't normally going to be as good, and you're not going to see the vast array of training. You're also not going to come away with a degree, which we've heard loud and clear a lot of operators in the industry, especially the EMS world, that they want to see pilots that can do more than just fly, that can work in management roles and those kinds of things. So definitely pluses and minuses on both sides. Obviously, we like the university side of things, of course, but it really comes down to your individual desires and needs. What are you looking to go do, and how fast are you trying to get there, and what routes who do you know, and where do you want to work?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to that is it's long-term risk mitigation. That's how I view collegiate programs. At some point, every one of us that love this industry, that fly in this industry, every one of us is going to lose our medical. What do we do then? And with the degree, you have other options. There's other avenues now. You can move into the business side. You can move into the management, the recruiting, all of these things. That's what that degree is going to give you.
And I'll just add onto that briefly, and I agree with Robbie and Mike. And of course, we are coming at it a little biased, but if you think about this, the certification, the FAA certification is always just a minimum. When you look at our degree programs, you're going to have additional coursework. So for example, our helicopter students are going to take a number of aviation safety courses. We have a physiology course with a night vision goggle lab that they'll get exposure to that you wouldn't necessarily get exposure to just by meeting the FAA certification standards as a minimum. Plus, of course, we talked about our connections with the industry and be able to help place students and have those pathway programs and have career fairs, are crucial in that networking side that is very important in the helicopter industry.
Okay, this kind of goes along with what
I think if I could add on that,
the medical program or the medical card. And Brent had sent this question in when SUU was making their presentation. You say older pilots. What age do you consider to be an older pilot?
Well, there's a lot of gray in my beard. The older pilots, I mean, in the rotor world, we're not necessarily confined by the same constraints that the airline world has. But some of the folks that we have seen that are hitting that age where their medical they're just not able to maintain it anymore. We're talking somewhere in the mid to late 60s is typically what we're starting to see. And we're very upfront with students when they're coming in who are transitioning from other careers as well. They're coming in at their mid 50s and saying, hey, I'm ready to do this career switch. And we let them know that while you can fly and the method of flying is different in the rotor world, the amount of time that you have to regain that or the return on their investment for the training is limited. I guess the short answer is somewhere in the 60s is what we're seeing.
Yeah, you're really making a bet on yourself. What we like to tell people a lot of times is 10 years is what we've kind of calculated. That's where you're going to get that return on investment, everything paid for. If you feel like you're going to be able to keep your medical and work for 10 years after you've graduated, then absolutely come and do this. If you think that you're not going to keep your medical for that 10 years, though, that's where you got to start questioning if it's a good career move for you.
Okay, next question is from Federico. Is there a high percentage of applicants that go through financing?
I would say yes. A vast majority of our students apply for some level of financing. Flight training, it is very expensive. Even if you have a scholarship, we do offer a full ride scholarship, but it's through the U.S. Army. So it's really up to the individual. Very few students come through and just pay for it all out of pocket. They usually have some sort of financial aid that they're able to achieve.
Yeah, and I'm glad Wes brought that up, because as we circle back to the advantages of a collegiate program versus a non-collegiate, is the ability to actually get financing. Banks are much more likely to lend toward a degree than they are to just outright flight training. They classify that as a career advancement loan if you're just going through a non-collegiate, non-degree program. Those loans typically come at a very high interest rate and are very difficult to get. If it's tied to education, that's a different story. And again, as Wes brought up there, the scholarships, we have $400,000 in scholarships that we give away specifically to rotor only annually. And what we're finding, and this is a really unfortunate part, and the folks here, my colleagues here that are in higher ed are going to know this. A lot of scholarships go unawarded every year simply because people do not apply for them, and that is the same with our rotor scholarships, and it's surprising. And what a little bit of paperwork will do, and especially when we're talking of tens of thousands of dollar reduction in their tuition for really a day's worth of paperwork. I wish more folks would take advantage of that across the country.
Honestly, that leads in beautifully into the next question from Justin. Do you folks think that the helicopter industry will ever recruit or offer scholarships in the way that fixed wing side was doing prior to the pandemic?
That's a very good question, and something that we have worked on, and I'm sure UND has also worked on this. One of the issues that we ran into is when you compare and contrast the rotor industry to the fixed wing industry, the rotor industry is really controlled by just a few really large players. And to develop the pipelines and to develop those scholarship models that the fixed wing world had was fairly simple for them. When we moved that to the rotor industry, instead of having a couple big players, we have hundreds of small to medium players. And the scholarships that are being awarded by the companies, well, if the scholarship is awarded by a company that could afford to do that, that pilot may not be eligible to work for that company for a few years. So that company is taking a huge gamble on a student. Hey, we're gonna help fund your training, and we want to see you in a couple of years, and hopefully by then you haven't been violated, you've kept your medical, you haven't done these various things, and you've completed your training. It's a tough sell, and that's one of the struggles that we have as a rotor industry. And to be quite honest, that's why we ended up just creating our own internal rotor scholarships, simply because it's really hard to get the industry to do it. And it's not that people don't want to do it, it's just a different industry than the fixed wing world.
I think we've spent a fair amount of time talking about financing and scholarships for pilots. What about financial opportunities for the maintenance guys, the guys who turn the wrenches and take baths in hydraulic fluid occasionally?
So luckily, it's a little different realm because the cost is so much less on that side. We have not had any issues so far with any of our students finding financing for the maintenance world. The amazing thing is that actually the return on investment for our AMT students is actually much better than it is for either helicopter or airplane pilots right now because of the low cost of the training. It's obviously a little bit more than what it would be to just get a degree, but we are not talking about, up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the training. You're down in the 40 and 50,000 and still walking out of school into $60,000 and $70,000 jobs. So it is a whole nother realm when you start talking about the financing for mechanics, because it is so much easier with the lower dollar amounts.
I think to add to that, I don't think it's necessarily the financing for the AMTs. I think it's getting the word out there and getting young people excited and knowledgeable about that career path. I mean, we see helicopters flying, we see airplanes flying. It's a very visible part of the industry, but the behind the scenes crucial aspect of maintaining those airframes is less visible. So I think that's where the challenge is there, is getting this next generation of young folks aware and excited about that field.
Yeah, and one of the things to go along with that, and I appreciate you bringing that up, is the perception of maintenance, A&P mechanics, is there's grease under the fingernails, they're working in a dirty shop, all of these different things. AMTs, aviation maintenance technicians, they are highly trained, highly organized, and very meticulous individuals. I'll tell you, I'd eat a sandwich if it was dropped on our maintenance floor. I don't think I'd do that in my own garage. I mean, they go home clean, and they're well respected. And so there's a bit of a perception issue with with this younger generation that, well, I don't want to go get dirty. Well, good. Don't become an auto mechanic. Become an aviation maintenance technician and go home clean and make some good money. But just for clarity, the return on investment when we're talking about education, what we're referring to is for every dollar that somebody puts into their education and into their training, the money that they will get out over their career is higher for a maintenance technician than it is for rotor or for an airline pilot, simply because the barrier to entry is so much lower.
What's an average time for a program for AMPs?
So it depends. It depends on if it's a degree or not. Our program is set up as a 2-year associate that can transition into a BS in aviation. I mean, that's our program. Most other programs, if they're non-degree, would be slightly shorter.
I see we're coming up on time. We've got a handful of other questions. Are we okay to continue with each of you? Okay, appreciate that. From Zach Carlito, is there a chance that the industry job requirements could shift away from specific straight hours logged to more proficiency-based requirements as a way to reach out to the lesser hour pilots? And the rest of the question disappeared on me. Sorry about that.
That is an amazing and very insightful question. And one of the things that we've been working towards and have started some preliminary discussions in Washington, D.C., is moving to a proficiency-based training model versus a flat hour base. I've flown with folks that have a couple thousand hours, and I've flown with folks that have 50 hours. And sometimes the hour model is predictive of the quality, but not always. A couple thousand-hour pilot who can't do an auto rotation to save their life, but I've got a 60-hour private pilot who hits the auto every time. So we're big believers in proficiency-based. However, the regulations do not follow that yet.
And just to add that, I think, let's go back pre-pandemic a couple steps, but we were actually already seeing that, and that even echoes the previous question of what are the benefits of attending a university program or well-established program at least versus Part 61 flight school. We're seeing with some of our pathway programs a reduction in just hours because they do recognize the quality of training is better coming from the university program. So instead of taking an applicant at 1,000 hours, which kind of was the norm for that tier 1 job, now they're willing to accept an applicant through a pathway partner at a university school at 750 hours. So we are already seeing that in the industry. Obviously, we hope that's going to continue once some of these operators get back on their feet. But I think we'll continue to see that in the future as well-established programs keep producing quality pilots.
Zach actually has several questions. I'm going to jump around a little bit, jump to some others, and then come back to his. From Holly, since a reduction of recruitment is the biggest issue you see coming, what does UND plan to do to address this issue?
Well, here's where I think we need to get creative, and I'll let Wes share some of his ideas as well. But students aren't able to come to us. Big trade shows like Oshkosh this summer, and I'm sure others will follow through, are not able to happen either safely, and so we understand that. So one of the things we're working on with people like Wes is bringing this experience to them, working on virtual tours, virtual intro flights in our helicopters, and really grasping some of those new technologies to bring it to them remotely, with the hopes of planting that seed, planting that excitement, and again, hopefully being able to welcoming them to our campuses in the near future. And then Wes, do you want to talk about some of the great videos you guys have been working on to spike interest that really hit this YouTube generation's buttons?
Yeah, I think that's also really critical for recruitments. There really aren't a lot of great, I don't want to say channels, but there's not a lot of great media out there for the younger generation that might be interested in the helicopter industry. There's a lot of professional, extremely well done, higher level, more interest pieces, but it's important that we do work with the next generation and try and attract and increase interest with them in just being a helicopter pilot. Yeah, right now we're seeing a lot of people that want to be helicopter pilots, but we're also seeing a decrease in people that want to have a hands-on job, and flying helicopter is a very hands-on job. So we need to come up with new ways to address that generation. And I think social media is just one of those ways to do it, but it's also going to be direct outreach from not just the universities, but even through the higher level operators, just to show what we do on a day-to-day basis, because it is still quite a bit of a mystery. People say, yeah, I took a tour once in the Grand Canyon, and that's kind of their only knowledge of helicopters. So more mainstream interaction with the younger generation is going to be critical, not in the next year or so, but certainly 2 years and more down the road.
I have a question from Surafel that actually I'm going to start out by recommending they go back and watch some of HAI's previous webinars. We just did one on this topic. How can we perform remote training right now? So
one of the positives that came out of the pandemic was the FAA has made some allowances for at least on the maintenance side, for the first time ever, approval to do the generals via online delivery, and that was something that we've been working on for a lot of years to try to make that happen. And it was really only with the crunch that came via the pandemic that allowed the FAA to see things how we saw them, and at least it allows students to start the maintenance training. The certain aspects of both flight and maintenance can be done online or via the distance learning method. At some point, however, you have to transition to the hands-on lab. So at least it gives students the ability to start.
Yeah, I think on the flight training side in particular, we are working with the FAA, and we're very close to being able to offer ground briefings. So this would be your typical one-on-one interaction virtually for the first time, which would be kind of a big step forward in this new world. And I believe it was Liberty University, I'll shout out to them, but they are also starting to do simulator training remotely. I just saw an article, I think it was this week. So that innovation is certainly coming. And we've been working, well, really for the last year and a half on what we call the virtual flight instructor, where if a student is at home and they have, a off-the-shelf flight simulator product, is there a way that we could present a true lesson to them to maintain some level of skill if they're already a student, or a student, give them kind of that virtual flight to get them interested.
Zach, Carlito, we'll go back to one of his questions. It's a two-part. It's kind of a little bit more complex. Is there any reason why specific curriculum to fill particular job needs, such as a direct path to fire or EMS, has not been created yet? And the second part is, will there in the near future be specific programs that train new pilots with 0 hours to become fully capable of firefighting or EMS operations at the time of graduation?
Yeah, so let me just quickly address the firefighting aspect. So, and I know that UND has a program that includes some of these more advanced flight training regimes, and in order to prepare the students as best as they possibly can for everybody to go out into the industry. So we have something similar. We include the night vision, as well as the external load training as part of just the standard curriculum. Everybody gets it as they go through. For students transitioning from the training world, assuming that they meet the hour requirements, they're transitioning onto the operator's certificate. And that operator has to feel comfortable with that pilot handling the long line, or operating within the rules and regulations that are put forward by the Forest Service. So to transition directly from the training world to create a pathway, it goes back to that the students, when they enter the pathway in the early days, may be very excited and may feel like they're adept at moving forward and handling a long line, fighting a fire. However, over the years that it's going to take them to do the training and to get there, they may not find themselves to be proficient, or the employer may not find them to be worthy to sling, several hundred gallons of water, or in the case of the Chinooks and the Sky Cranes, much bigger loads of water under the aircraft. And while it can be seen as a glamorous and wonderful job, and it is, external load and firefighting is probably one of the most difficult things you can do in a helicopter. And as we have seen with folks going through our training, we've had everything from folks throwing up because they're no longer flying. They're looking down at the load instead of out of the horizon, and it's a different thing. Or they forget how to fly, period. It's tough. So a pathway to the firefighting world, while it's great in concept, it's difficult. There's some steps in between that would be very hard to skip.
We have a question from Robert. Have you considered providing degree equivalency and credit for experienced pilots who do not have a university background, or providing a path for them to achieve a PSS for these pilots? I'm not familiar with PSS.
So and my assumption is there's a program similar at UND, but for individuals that present FAA certificates, we can do what's called a credit by examination, and so we give them the equivalent credits if they were to have taken those courses with us. So that's a good way to jumpstart a degree for individuals that do not have anything. And then if there's other training that the individual pilot has gone through and has some sort of syllabus or some sort of curriculum that we can take a look at and evaluate, then we have and we do award credits based on that evaluation. So UND, you guys have anything similar to that?
I think all universities are a little bit different in how their organizations handle the life experience for credit. So I think it's important just to do your research and reach out to the universities that you're interested in and ask those good questions.
Robert did get back. He apparently, like me, had a typo, not PSS, it was a BSS. He was looking for a bachelor's degree. So, from Federico, do any of you offer alliances with certified flight training schools in foreign countries?
We do not currently know.
Yeah, nor do we. We have international students, but we do not have formalized partnerships with international partners.
Okay, we've got our final question now from Zach. One big hurdle for new pilots to overcome is the cost of training. Is there any discussion on how to lessen the burden of this to help fuel the pipeline? And if so, how is this being accomplished?
Well,
I think we can with that. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just to say, Wes touched on theirs. And that's a great pathway with the, and I probably messed that up, but with the Army, that program you have with the Army for a full ride. You know, the military avenue is a great way, or scholarships. And I said earlier that, you know, many scholarships go unawarded, and it's simply because individuals do not want to put the day's worth of paperwork into the application. But if that application is worth $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, that is the best day's work you will ever do. And there's resources out there. You have to research them. You have to apply for them, and it really comes down to that collegiate model. That's where those avenues are going to be open. The Part 61 schools may have their own internal scholarships or funding methods, but you know, there's going to be work involved. Money is never just given out. You have to do some work, and in the form of scholarships, you typically have to do a little essay, a little paper, some forms. It's not a big deal, especially when you equate the time that you're putting into that is going to turn into thousands of dollars. Please do the work.
If I could just add to that as well, one of our mottos is to provide the best aviation education at a reasonable cost to our students. So every decision that we make, in fact, we just transitioned our fleet to be a complete R44 fleet, again, being very cost conscious. We've also started to invest in virtual reality training, and this is actually a benefit that we're giving to our students, both fixed wing and helicopter, that is free for them to use to practice and to stay proficient, and so that their time in the aircraft is better spent, and hopefully over time will lessen those average hours to the various certificates and ratings. So Wes, I don't know if you want to add to that. I know you're responsible for our helicopter VR lab.
Yeah, we've done, well, I kind of mentioned in the presentation, but really since 2013, we've looked at, you know, historically we've done a lot of contract training, which is somebody who already has a job coming here, you know, has all their training paid for, to an undergraduate model, which is, you know, somebody who walks in and wants to get all their flight training at a reasonable cost, as Dr. Bierke mentioned. And one of the ways we do that is we streamline all of our training to really make it as efficient as possible and cost effective as possible. And then, yeah, the addition of virtual reality, continuity of training, you know, changing our fleet to the R44 has tremendously increased our efficiency and our uptime of our aircraft, which makes it easier for the student. So now we are, you know, sending a student through their commercial at 150 hours, not going above that, you know, becoming a CFII at 200 hours so they can start working right away. So I think the flight school, every flight school is going to work to minimize costs in the first place, and then also having those financing options available through, you know, either university or through your flight school is going to be tremendously important. Even if you do get the scholarships, they're probably not going to cover everything that you're going to go through. So either having, you know, a source of money that you're going to use for flight training, or being able to use financial aid is going to be critical. And then once you're here, obviously, yeah, putting in the work, staying proficient, staying over summer semesters, things like that make a huge difference in getting done in a cost-effective manner. And everybody looks at helicopter flight training and say, oh, it's too expensive, but I mean, you can get a degree in graphic design for as much as you pay for all your flight training and your degree from University of North Dakota. It just depends on where you're going to school and what you want to do. If it's something you really want to do, cost shouldn't necessarily be a barrier if you're willing to put in the work and apply for the scholarships and you apply for financial aid and all those kind of things.
Yeah. Oh, real quick, Robbie's gonna say something too here. One of the best ways to reduce costs is to make sure that your training is linear, and Wes said it, don't take summers off. If you're in a collegiate program, if you're in a Part 61 program, train straight through. And the biggest way to reduce cost, study. That's it.
Yep. And then I was just going to mention as well, there's always that quality versus cost, right? Where do you fit? You want the best quality of education? Well, it's going to cost a little bit more. What we like to say at SUU is that there's a very, very big difference between knowing how to fly and being a pilot. Being a pilot is going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's going to make you a better aviator. It's going to make you a safer aviator. It's going to help you to get jobs much, much easier. Your road through your career is going to be much easier if you take the courses and you spend the money and the time to become a pilot, not just somebody who knows how to fly.
Okay, well, Wes, Robbie and Mike and Dr. Bjerke, we certainly appreciate the time. We really appreciate the fact that you went over the time to respond to all the questions. The information has just been incredibly valuable. We certainly appreciate your assistance this afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
We will have another webinar next week. First of all, there will be a questionnaire that will be coming to our viewers here very shortly. We encourage you to respond. One of the best ways to tell us what information is helpful for you is to tell us what you'd like to hear. We've gotten a lot of information from you folks on what topics we should address, and we're looking forward to those. Next week, we are going to be addressing high tech, the integration of UAS systems into helicopter businesses. Watch for the link in email, on social media, and in Rotor Daily. And as always, if there's something that HAI can do for you, isn't doing for you, we're not doing enough, if you have complaints or compliments, please let us know. The best way to do so is to follow or to use the president@rotor.org email address. That does go directly to James Viola, our president and CEO, and that information is also shared with our various departments. As always, stay safe, fly safe, and we'll see you next week.